to listen to this presentation, but I think more importantly, after the presentation, it'd be really good if we can have a discussion about the implications of this research, yes, but some of the contemporary issues in the policing of drug markets that are currently being dealt with by police in different service areas across the UK. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully not fluff it up, given that it's been recorded. So as is often the case with this sort of thing, can somebody just let me know that they can see my slides all right?
Yeah, that's fine, Matt.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, so I'm going to speak about the key findings from the project and give you an overview of what it is we did over the next 30 minutes or so. The project is an N8 small grant project that has been done in collaboration between the University of Sheffield and South Yorkshire Police. We were very keen from the very beginning to ensure that the project was co-produced. So every element of the project has been produced together between myself and Xavier and the team at South Yorkshire Police, from the conceptualization of the project, its design, through to the data collection, analysis, and also the dissemination and write-up, as you can see from the photographs that I've included on this opening slide. That's me alongside some of my SYP collaborators there, presenting at the British Society of Criminology Conference and also the European Society of Criminology Conference as well. So it was, a really good experience for me. I learned a lot by doing that co-production, and I'm happy to talk about how we did that and some of the value that we got from that if anybody is of interest. In terms of the presentation today, however, what I'm going to do is start by setting out the rationale for the project. I'll then briefly outline the research questions and the methods that we used to answer them. I'll go through some of the key findings. Inevitably, it is going to be a selection of some of the key findings. I can't go through everything during the course of this presentation. There is a policy brief document that's already available on the N8 website, but I'm happy to share more findings, more detail and depth with anybody who might be interested. And then I'll offer some concluding thoughts and consider the implications for research, policy and practice at the end. So in terms of our rationale, there are a few reasons why we decided to focus on the policing of drug markets for this small grants project. I mean, personally, I've been involved in research on policing drug markets for about 15 years. So I was pleased that South Yorkshire Police had an interest in this area as well. And there were some recent developments that I think prompted that. And you can see nationally that the policy context has developed quite rapidly over recent years and really thrust drug-related problems in the policing of drugs into the limelight in various ways. So you can see here, simply from the covers of these policy documents, that have featured drug issues quite prominently, from the modern crime prevention strategy that draws a lot of attention to drug-related crime, organized crime, acquisitive crimes committed by people who use drugs. The serious violence strategy put a lot of emphasis on county lines and that link between drugs and violence. And then I'll skip most recently to the 2021 drug strategy of the former government, which of course has set the strategic direction for police across the country, introduced a new outcomes framework. So it struck us that it was a good time to focus in on this project because of that national policy context. More broadly, over the last few years, I've been looking very carefully at different activities that have been performed by police services across the country in the drug space. And one thing that has struck me is the wide variety of roles that the police perform, and also the expanding and evolving nature of the police role within the policing of drug markets. And here I've included some screenshots of some news reports that I've collected over recent years to try and illustrate some of these different roles that the police are involved with. And I do this just to stress that whilst policing drugs is often characterized as being drug law enforcement, the police are doing so much more than that. And this slide doesn't capture everything. It certainly can't do it justice. But if we start at the top left, you can see there a slide relating to Operation Venetic. Police working collaboratively across the country with international enforcement agencies as well to deal with organised criminality at that transnational level. I'm sure all of you will be familiar with county lines and the issues that that is presenting in terms of the harms that it's causing across the country. And you can see there in the bottom left that this has taken up a great deal of police resource. A lot of effort has been focused on trying to tackle these issues. One of the reasons why county lines is such a priority is the fact that it is associated with various forms of exploitation, child criminal exploitation in particular, and that has, of course, generated a lot of news media headlines, policy and practice responses. But the police don't simply perform enforcement roles or those safeguarding and protection roles. They play a role in trying to reduce demand, in sending out messages. You can see that the Met Commissioner and various others have been outspoken about the demand that is causing supply and the harms that are caused by the drug market. Over recent years as well, since around 2015, we've seen a number of forces starting to experiment with different forms of diversion scheme as well. And I've included a couple of examples on this slide. Diversion schemes that are seeing individuals who are arrested in possession of drugs, for example, or for a drug-related offence, being diverted into support. So that might be a treatment service, for example, or a police force. Durham being an example of this, employ navigators to deliver that service internally. And it's not just for people who use drugs that we've started to see diversion emerging. We've also started to see police forces experimenting with diversion for people who are involved in the supply of drugs as well. An example that I've included here is from Bristol, their Call-In initiative, which is a partnership between Avon and Somerset Constabulary, Golden Key would be the third sector organisation, and a few others. But it's recognising what some of the underlying reasons are why people become involved in drug market and gang-related activity and trying to address those underlying causes. What we've also seen in recent years is a significant increase in drug-related deaths, and the police have also started to play an active role in trying to reduce that. Diversion has one role to play in that, but you can also see pilots across the country of police officers carrying naloxone. So I'm going to wrap up this slide. What I really wanted to stress with it is the variety of roles that the police are performing under that umbrella of policing drug markets. Another rationale for doing this project relates to the research evidence base. Commentators over a number of years have stressed that there is a lack of evidence around the impact of drug law enforcement. And this is something that the government themselves have found when they carried out the evaluation of their 2010 drug strategy. What the evidence suggests is that you're most likely to get positive outcomes if you are targeting your resources at the most harmful offenders, or in a place-based way using problem-oriented multi-agency initiatives. There is evidence that law enforcement and policing initiatives can disrupt markets at all levels, but generally speaking, the effects are short-lived. The evidence also suggests that attempts to remove drugs from the market through seizures has very limited impact upon availability, if any impact at all. What we also know from the evidence is that there can be unintended consequences of enforcement. The evaluation that the government carried out noting drug market violence and also that negative impact that involvement with the criminal justice system can have on an individual. Dame Carol Black's review stressed that there was a need to develop the evidence base about the impact of different enforcement interventions, and that again acts as a motivation for us to do this particular project, to try and make a small contribution to this subject area. And last but not least, the rationale, perhaps a little bit more of an academic rationale, is this idea of harm reduction policing. These concepts of harm and harm reduction are widely used through throughout policing. You can see them in the Thrive model, for example, in how the police manage risk in law enforcement through the morale model. There's the crime severity score, as well as the Cambridge Crime Arm Index. The idea of harm reduction is also something that is widespread in drug policy and practice. I've included a definition of harm reduction on this slide, that it's aiming to minimize the negative health, social, and legal impacts that are associated with drug use. It's been expanded through social harm perspectives, thinking about anything that can compromise human flourishing in a manner that could have been prevented. Myself and colleagues, including Dr. Jack Spicer, have tried to develop this concept. I've included our definition on this slide, and that is the adoption of evidence-based policies and practices which aim to reduce the adverse health, social, and economic consequences associated with the use of drugs, drug markets, and efforts to control them through the criminal justice system. So we wanted to have a look at police perceptions of harm, what harm reduction policing was looking like in contemporary practice, and what some of the barriers are to further realizing this model of drugs policing. So these are the questions that we decided upon. So how do the police perceive and prioritize harms associated with drug markets? How do they define success and evaluate their impact? And are there any ways in which we can improve performance indicators to incorporate a wider range of drug-related harms? Now, to answer these questions, we took a mixed methods approach to the study, which focused on document analysis and interviews. So the documents that we analysed were wide-ranging, from national strategies to police force drug strategies and police and crime plans. We were able to work closely with a number of people within South Yorkshire Police to get some case files, what we're referring to here as operational records, to redact those and to carry out an analysis of those documents, as well as various analytical products. The main method that was used for this project was interviews, and we carried out 44 interviews in total. 29 of those were within South Yorkshire Police, both officers and staff officers, ranging from the senior command team through middle management to frontline officers in a range of different departments and roles, in order to try to capture the different approaches to drugs policing at different levels. We were keen to also include the regional organised crime unit and also the National Crime Agency and the British Transport Police. And then reflecting on the fact that drugs policing isn't something that is solely done by the police, we wanted to interview a range of partners. These were interviewed, partners were interviewed, those based in Sheffield, included drug treatment services, commissioning bodies, the violence reduction unit, and a few other services as well. And this culminated in a co-production workshop where we presented our findings, and also the implications for research, policy, and practice were discussed. So what I'd like to do now is move on to present some of the key findings, starting with what is quite a complex tree map. So I'll talk around this a little bit and try and demonstrate to you what it is illustrating. Before each of the interviews, we asked our interviewees to do a pre-interview exercise, which actually involved two exercises. One focused on police roles, one focused on drug-related harms. What we did was put together a list of 42 roles that the police perform in drug markets. This list was put together through looking at policy documents, academic literature on drugs policing, and conversations that we had with our police partners to try and capture that range of roles. And then we asked our interviewees to identify 10 that they considered to be the most important. Originally, we wanted them to rank those 10 in hierarchical order. A few of our participants did this, but most said that it was hard enough just choosing 10 roles, and that they couldn't or didn't have the time to try to rank them. So we weren't able to do that. But 42 out of the 44 participants completed these exercises. And this tree map represents 89% of these responses. Roles that were selected by fewer than 7 people have been excluded. We've broken it down into the 4 Ps as one way of trying to organise the findings of this. So pursue, protect, prevent and prepare. We did find, and we drilled down into some of these findings during the interviews, that the police gave a lot of emphasis to the enforcement of drug laws. This is something that they sign up to do. It's their oath. It's a role of the police to uphold the laws of the land, and it's a unique power that they have, that warrant card. So you can see why emphasis is often placed on that and various other crime control functions. But as you can see from this slide, the police had a variety of different roles that they considered to be important, and many of them were around those protect and prevent functions. And what I've tried to do with the orange squares is show you the different roles that could fall within that harm reduction policing model, to show that the police are already doing a lot that constitutes harm reduction policing. So targeting the most violent and exploitative elements of the drug trade, trying to reduce the supply of drugs that cause the most harm, targeting hotspots and the most harmful offenders. Then, of course, trying to protect and safeguard vulnerable people, protect victims from harm, those trauma-informed approaches to policing, and then through to preventing people becoming involved in organised crime or drug market activity, diverting individuals, so on and so forth. It's also worth pointing out that the other roles that aren't highlighted in orange could perform harm reduction functions, so disruption, enforcement, the targeting of county lines. It very much depends on the purpose of that enforcement or disruption, what the goal of it is and what it actually achieved. With this slide, what I'm showing you is the roles that individuals did not identify as being particularly important. These are roles that either 0 people chose or 1 or 2 of the research participants. And there are a few things that I take from this. You may take others, but I'd just like to highlight 2 things. I think it's very interesting that none of our participants thought that targeting the retail market was an important role of the police. You can also see that only 1 thought targeting people who use drugs and processing them through the criminal justice system was an important role, and only 2 thought the police performed an important function in reducing demand or the use of drugs. And this, in some respects, contrasted with the interviews that we did, where police officers often stress the need to reduce demand. It can't all be about reducing supply, for example. So what does this tell us? Perhaps it shows us that the police don't see their role as being reducing demand, the use of drugs. This is something that is carried out by partner agencies. It's done by national policy through education, treatment, that sort of thing. But also that they don't think they should be, perhaps as much as they do, targeting people and processing them through the criminal justice system, that there are other ways of trying to deal with these issues, for example, diversion. Another finding that I'll highlight from this slide before moving on to the next is that few of our interviewees thought that the police played a role in supporting people with their recovery, their desistance from crime, and reducing reoffending. Again, I think this is the police looking at what their role is in the criminal justice process and recognizing that, for example, police and probation perform important roles in that respect. But again, it does contrast with some of the interviews where interviewees stress the importance of reducing reoffending in our responses to drugs, and also trying to ensure that individuals can recover from their drug use and also stop committing crime. So we found these findings to be particularly interesting, and hopefully we can have a chat about those and other issues when I finish presenting. The second pre-interview exercise related to drug-related harms. So in a similar way to the police roles, what we wanted to do was ask our participants which of these harms they think should be prioritised when policing drug markets. And we presented them with a list of 126 different harms, which we'd organised into a taxonomy, again looking at relevant policy documents, academic literature, and having conversations with our police colleagues. And this tree map represents 75% of responses, those where we got lower than 5 have been excluded from it. As you might expect, our police participants emphasised crime and violence quite a lot in terms of the harms that they thought should be prioritised when policing drug markets. That is to be expected given the role that the police perform. But I think there are a few findings within this tree map that are worth highlighting. One, the number one harm that people selected was the risk of exploitation. That is what they considered to be the harm that should be prioritised when policing drugs. Interesting as well, the number of health-related harms that were prioritised by our interviewees, in particular around overdose and death, and that physical and mental illness that can come from a person's drug use. You can also see a range of different factors being highlighted that are more social, so impact upon children and family, the life chances of an individual as well. So you can see here that our police participants recognized a broad range of different drug-related harms that they considered to be important. They certainly weren't simply policing drugs through that crime reduction lens. They saw it in a much broader way. One of the things that we have done with our analysis is also pick out the differences between the police and our partner agencies. And I think, again, it won't come as any surprise, but our partner agencies tended to give much greater emphasis to the health, the children, the family, the life chances harms within this diagram. What I'm going to move on to focus on now are the interview findings. And I've tried to include in bold some of the key areas to take away from these quotes. I'm not simply going to read them out, but what I'm trying to do is provide you with an overview of some of the findings around these different themes. Just catch my breath before I do that. So in terms of perspectives of success, we found through interviews that individuals saw success in different ways. In part, this might be related to the roles that they were performing, the experience that they'd had during their service. It was widely recognised that there wasn't a clear definition of success, and in South Yorkshire, part of this issue was because there wasn't a forced drug strategy that clearly sought to define success and what this looks like. Some individuals, they saw success as catching and convicting those high-level nominals, those high-harm offenders, those, for example, who may be perpetrating serious acts of violence, have access to firearms, or exploiting vulnerable individuals, are moving large quantities of drugs and have reach across the country. Seizing their assets is, of course, another part of that operation. Others focused on stopping people dying, trying to make drug markets less risky for people. Harm reduction certainly featured in what definitions of success look like, and you can see that from the third quotation that I've included: collecting that intelligence to enable the police to properly judge the threat and harm, mobilizing and deploying against that, mitigating the threat, and therefore sustaining public protection moving forward. None of our participants thought that the police or partners or the government, anybody, was going to be able to eradicate drug markets. You can see this in the fourth quotations. We are not going to stop drugs. Therefore, what can be achieved is to reduce the harms that are caused by them. So this is a pragmatic response. It's a realistic response, but it's not one that will often be acknowledged publicly. Officers who are involved in tackling drugs on the front line through various operations describe their task as being keeping a lid on things, playing whack-a-mole, taking out one dealer, an organized crime group or elements of that, and then simply moving on to the next one, because all they can do is take those individual wins. And those individual wins for many police officers were summed up by the sentence that individuals received when they brought them to court, and that's something that's put across in that final quotation there. In terms of evaluating impact, and this was another one of our key research questions, it was unanimous from our interviewees that they didn't think the police were doing enough evaluation. I mean, I'm interpreting evaluation in broad terms. I'm not thinking here just about RCTs or anything like that. I appreciate, as did my participants, that evaluation can take various forms. What I'm largely focusing on here is that impact that policing operations have on drug markets and drug-related harms in the community. Other than a bit of feedback that might come from community contacts, intelligence that might come through after an operation has been carried out, very little is actually done to find out whether or not the police actually achieved what they set out to do, what the impact of their work has been, and whether or not they are doing the right things. Now, there were a variety of reasons that were given by participants for this to explain the lack of evaluation in the area. There are methodological challenges with trying to evaluate the impact of policing interventions on drug markets. There are data issues, accessibility issues. There are also resource implications to it as well. So that's something to bear in mind. Even on an operational level, however, our interviewees said that it was very rare for the police to commission a results analysis. So a lot of investment can go into a drug law enforcement operation, a lot of time, a lot of money, but very rarely do the police analyze the results that they achieve by bringing in all those different elements of intelligence, analysis, local policing, other agencies, healthcare, etc. As you can see from that quotation from a member of police staff. Of course, the police are doing a host of different things to evaluate the impact that they have. They're very good at doing debriefing after their investigations, learning from that investigation, feeding that into the next one. Problem profiles are carried out by analysts, which give a good picture of that problem in the local area. But on a case-by-case basis or overall, is it something that has been done to evaluate and understand that wider harm piece? It isn't. But a number of our participants highlighted that some of this is currently ongoing. The clear whole build pilots are being evaluated in large part because the Home Office has contributed resources to doing that. We are also awaiting the evaluation of Project Adder from Project Adder sites. So hopefully the evidence base will develop in the not too distant future and some more knowledge can be shared on these issues. Another explanation given for the lack of evaluation is the fact that in policing, the focus is usually on the outputs of policing interventions rather than the outcomes, in part because they're easier to measure, in part because policing is very short term in its approach. They do one job, they move on to the next job. There's a lot of demand. There's a need to be reactive and responsive to that demand as it's coming in. So constantly changing from one job to the next was an explanation that was given. Another was that often the police are directed by government policies, those changes in policies, the election cycles, and the outputs that the government want the police to focus on. That is often what gets measured, what gets that attention. So there are more explanations essentially that I'm looking at here. From the front line, both officers and staff, there was a little bit of frustration within the organization. Mixed messages sometimes came from senior command where they would ask their personnel to focus on quality jobs over quantity, yet then go to them for performance indicators and figures as well. So they weren't entirely sure always what it was that they were supposed to be focusing on. I'm now going to move through a few of the key performance measures, starting with arrests and seizures, because arrests and seizures are often the way in which the police do measure success, or at least promote the impact that enforcement interventions have had. Publicly, it's the sort of data that you'll see in news media reports and press releases. And we wanted to try and understand why they get the attention that they do, what police thought about these different measures. And as you can see from the quotations that I've included in this slide, there's an understanding as to why these are important measures, why they are widely used. But there's also frustration in that they can only tell us so much, and that they can be misleading, and that there are other measures that could be better used. In terms of seizures and arrests, it's those headline figures. One of the senior officers says that jazz hands moment, that you may be able to take a photo of a table with large quantities of drugs on it that you've taken off the street, and hopefully that will reassure the public that the police are doing something. And indeed, from that command perspective, the police have got to show that they are taking action through facts and figures. And you can see there from the second quotation that to demonstrate these facts and figures, often police end up arresting the low-hanging fruit, those individuals that are often in public spaces that are easier to identify, easier to stop, search, arrest. So these individuals are unlikely to have a big impact upon the drug market and drug-related harms, but they do make up the bulk of the figures. Another interviewee pointed out that arrest data can actually be quite misleading. So you've arrested 13 people, okay? Many people would read that as being a success. It could result in criminal justice outcomes. But then when you actually look at what happens after those arrests, it might be that 9 of those are no further action because there isn't enough evidence. More of them may be bailed or released under investigation, straight back out into the community, perhaps continuing to commit supply offences or other offences as well. So 13 arrests, rarely actually as impactful as that figure might suggest. And the final quotation I've included is around seizures of drugs and firearms in particular. That officer stressing the point that it's not actually able to give us an indication about availability or the impact that the police are having in the service area. It's simply a measure of the police generating their results by focusing in on particular areas. So it's more about the activity. Disruption was identified as the most important role that the police are performing in the policing of drug markets in those pre-interview exercises. And indeed, we spent a lot of time talking about disruption in the interviews. And it is something that is highly valued, but it's also something that is misunderstood. Few people, for example, could define the difference between a minor, a moderate, or a major disruption. There was frustration about the criteria that was set, the difficulty of ensuring that a disruption is a planned and targeted event, for example, or being able to get evidence that can impact the evidence of the impact of the disruption on the capabilities of an organized crime group, for example. Some of the measures that have been brought in through the new drug strategy, for example, closing county lines, these are recognized to be problematic in that they're open to interpretation. Does it simply mean closing down a phone line, or does it mean archiving the group that is involved in the county line? So there are different understandings there. The final point around disruption that I want to draw your attention to is that it was widely recognized that disruptions are generally in the form of those outputs that I've already mentioned. So arrests and seizures, they usually pursue focused. Very few of the disruptions that were coming through were around prevent, for example, or protect. So that potentially is something that could be given more attention moving forward. Another area that we discussed in interviews were those unintended consequences of drugs policing. And all of our interviewees had a lot of knowledge and understanding about this issue. They gave us examples from their experience of where they saw the policing of drugs having these unintended, these negative consequences. So that could be, as you see from that first quotation, a seizure resulting in new drugs entering a marketplace that are more dangerous than the others, perhaps because they're pure and mixed with different adulterants, and that can lead to drug-related deaths. A lot of people spoke about the impact of criminalization, that criminal record and being processed through the criminal justice system on an individual's life chances. It's almost ensuring that some people will end up stuck in criminal activity and drug market activity. As one of our interviewees said, their path now is that they're either going to die, they're either going to get shot or end up in prison. So this of course, is not the desired outcome, but it is something that can happen. A lot of conversations focused around drug debts and the impact that arresting an individual, seizing the drugs that they have on them, and then releasing them back into the community, the impact that can have. Others talked about the fact that individuals may go to prison, they come out an even bigger problem because their networks develop, the knowledge and understanding of drug market develops. And then the final example I've included on this slide is how drug market interventions can inadvertently lead to increases in violence because of the competition, new groups moving in to take over a market, maybe more violent than the group that went before, for example. So officers all had examples that they could share about this. And indeed, we then went on to talk about how you can mitigate these risks. And what's essential here is the threat and risk detection systems that are in place and optimized to try and understand what these unintended consequences might be and how they can be mitigated. But it was equally recognized that the police aren't able to do very much about many of these unintended consequences. In part, this was cultural, because there isn't much sympathy for the problems that are likely to be caused to criminals by the police doing enforcement action. There was a widespread view that individuals have made a choice to become involved in drug market activity, therefore you should live with the consequences. There was also that view that you look at who is suffering the harm. Is it somebody who is knowingly committing a crime, or is it members of the community, the innocent victims of the drug trade? So all of this is going to impact upon decision-making processes. And of course, the police have to uphold the law. They can't simply say, well, keep your drugs, go about your business, we're not going to take them off you so you're not in debt. That's not really a response that is available to them. So figuring out what more can be done, how individuals can be better safeguarded, is perhaps an area for further research and discussion. But one of the areas that was discussed a lot in interviews is the potential for more diversion, not simply for people who use drugs, but those who are involved in drug market activities as well that are connected to supply offences. You can see here in these slides that there was appetite for this throughout the ranks. The recognition that people who are involved in drug markets, particularly at the lower levels, some of the most vulnerable in society, that, you know, when you're talking about that tier of drug dealer, your lower level dealers, people who use drugs, who supply drugs, people who may be coerced into drug distribution for various reasons, perhaps socioeconomic necessity as well, there is the potential to do diversion, particularly when these individuals are young, when they're just starting out in their drug career. What we also found was that our interviewees wanted more information about what happens after somebody has been diverted. They wanted more long-term follow-up on what happens following that diversion. So again, this is something that we found could be done as well. So I'm going to wrap it up because I appreciate that I've been talking for a long time and all I can see is my slides, so I've no idea what's going on in the room. So I've only got two left, my conclusions and the implications for research. So as we expected, this project revealed that the policing of drugs is far more than simply law enforcement, and that the police role has expanded and evolved a lot over recent years. There is a lot of commonality, but there continue to be tensions and competing conceptions of the police role and which drug-related harms should be prioritized. But again, this is understandable. Police organizations are complex organizations, and individuals within those organizations have different values and views about what their role is and what they should be prioritizing. It seems as though the police are receptive to this idea of harm reduction policing, but there are still a number of cultural, organizational and political barriers to overcome, and ways in which this might be done. One may be to ensure that any forced drug strategies are underpinned by harm reduction principles. Another might be that we can produce a police education package on the policing of drug markets, focusing in on drug-related harms and the impact of policing interventions. Indeed, many of our interviews stress that police officers and staff don't receive very much training, education on the policing of drug markets. This was recognised to be a gap in this area. So since completing this project, our team has managed to secure some additional funding and have started producing an education package that we hope will be of value to police staff, officers and partners who are interested in the policing of drugs. Last slide. Implications for research. So drawing on all of the research that we've done, we tried to identify 4 key implications that we could act on or others could act on moving forward. In terms of trying to help the police and partners with evaluating the policing of drug markets, the development of a methodological toolkit might be a valuable use of our time so that the police can draw on that to help them evaluate their impact. I think also reviewing police and partner data to capture what happens to people who are either criminalized, diverted or safeguarded would just help develop that knowledge and understanding of those different options that the police have for dealing with drug offenders. A rapid evidence review would be very useful so that we are aware of the existing research around diversionary activities in that context of police and drug markets. And last but not least, in a local service area, it would be good to carry out a mapping exercise so that the police are fully aware of all of the options that are available to them for diverting people who use or supply drugs. I very much appreciate your attention throughout this presentation, and I hope that we will now be able to have a chat about some of these findings, and I should be able to answer some of the questions that you've had. Although I'm going to draft in Xavier and my SYP colleagues as well, because I've spoken far too much.
Thanks ever so much there, Matt. That was a really interesting presentation and a lot to think about. I think as we go to the Q&A session now, I know we've got a fair few attendees from policing background in attendance, and I think there are a couple of the members of the team that worked on the project from South Yorkshire here. And I just wanted to see if we could have maybe their view on what they took from this project, like what was their key takeaway from this project in terms of like what can change at like a local policing level, or if they think that there needs to be a change at like a national policy level. So I think
shall we take Jeff's question to give?
Yes, yeah, I'll put that out and we'll see if we get any responses on that one. I think Ashley is on the team, but Jeff, if we have any more sort of general feedback from practitioners, that'd be useful. Mine was a quite specific question about organised crime disruption units in forces, which is a bit sort of off at an angle, really. I mean, I can ask it now, but yeah, you go ahead, Jeff, and then we'll see.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm glad we haven't wasted all our N8 money on this project, Matt and colleagues. It's been really useful and raises, I think, some really important questions. And you know, congratulations on completing the research and the report and everything. I think evaluation of success, you're absolutely right, really hard to measure. And I particularly was wondering about the units. I mean, I call them broadly organised crime disruption units, but the likes of Matrix, for example, at Merseyside, or is it Challenger at GMP, that have a remit of driving around areas where they think gangs are operating, trying to disrupt those gangs, and then raiding houses to try and find drugs. And it seems that certainly in the first part of that, actually, they're doing the proactive intelligence gathering and breaking up of gangs, lots of stop searches, for example. We found in our observations that the hit rate was incredibly low, and that actually it was absolutely as you set out, that success was, although there was lots of talks about those massive fines, actually we never saw one of those. All we saw was people being lifted for really, really small amounts of cannabis. But I don't know to what extent whether you have views in terms of whether the investment in those groups, in terms of personnel training, everything, makes a proper evaluation actually quite difficult to do. Sorry, I said it was a bit of a niche question, so I apologise for that.
I think groups in one form or another certainly seem to exist in different forces. In SYP, they've got Fortify, but this is a multi-agency initiative. I think what you were focusing on there would be the more enforcement side of policing OCGs, Jeff. And what a lot of our interviewees talked about as well was what goes on behind the scenes in the meetings between the police and partner agencies to try to do more of the other P's, if we're looking at it in those terms. So what can be done by liaising with schools around prevention and protection, for example. There are different ways for partners to intervene earlier rather than being reliant upon knocking on someone's door to see if they've got any drugs in their person. Can information sharing and collaborative working help deal with these things earlier and in a more proactive and preventative way? So I think those units have more to them than just those enforcement operations that you were talking about there, albeit that is certainly an important strand of the activities that they do. I mean, in South Yorkshire Police, a lot of the discussion did talk about the fact that drugs policing is very much under-resourced, that these units have very few officers and staff dedicated to them, which makes it very difficult for them to do longer-term proactive work because they are having to react to jobs coming in very quickly, and sometimes just getting a warrant, for example, is the fastest way to try and resolve an operation. So those were other things that we were discussing as well. But in terms of an evaluation, when you've got limited resources, it's unlikely that you're wanting to invest those resources in a large scale evaluation. But I think, internally within the police organization, there are great researchers and analysts that could be tasked with doing some evaluation work around drugs policing, working in that partnership context. It doesn't just have to be academics in universities and other researchers that can do this. But I think to get this started, we need to be very clear about what success looks like, what the different outcomes are, and how we can measure the outcomes rather than simply focusing on those outputs and then thinking about what can be done to evaluate the impacts of these different operations. Because there's research.
Before Xavier, I think Xavier's got a follow up on that, but I think that was sort of my point. I didn't explain it very well, which is that the groups that we observed didn't do that partnership working. Once things were handed over to the criminal justice system, they were more or less forgotten. This was sort of your tactical aid units, whose bread, and they did other stuff, but their bread and butter was they saw their job as disrupting these crime groups, and incredibly expensive, but incredibly difficult to evaluate success, but also incredibly difficult politically to take money away from to put into the type of partnership activity you're thinking about. But sorry, Xavier, I think you were going to respond anyway.
Yeah, no, very brief. I mean, I completely agree with everything that's been said. The interesting thing that came up a few times in this research and on another project that I'm doing, where the footprint is around the Yorkshire and the Humber, is Clear Hold Build, the kind of a multi-agency initiative, and the units that you're talking about, Jeff, I guess would be involved in the clear element, and then the hold and the build would be what comes next in some of these communities in terms of that's where I guess the multi-agency partnership element would come in terms of making sure that OCGs or urban street gangs and drug markets continue to be disrupted in the long term and don't just get vacuums don't just get filled as was the issue quite often. So I think I agree with what you've said. I suppose in terms of evaluation, maybe police colleagues on the call would say that the real value of evaluation would be to see what do things look like after the build rather than just after the clear. And I'm not sure how widely clear hold build has been rolled out. My impression from interviews over the past sort of 12 months has been that it's relatively early days with it, but there seemed to be quite a bit of enthusiasm for it among the police. Maybe that's right. Maybe people on the call will say that's not right, but that was my impression. I don't know what you thought, Matt.
Thanks, Xavier.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we've got a couple of other questions, comments there from Scott Owen and Ashley Rogers. I'm not sure whose hand came up first, but yeah, Scott, if you want to.
I'll help you out, Helen. Mine's less of a question and more just a pat on the back kind of comment, really, gents. I've been involved in analysing drug markets for some time. I wrote the original drug market profile for Bedfordshire, and I'm in the unenviable position of having to refresh that soon. So got lots from both your presentation and your findings, and just sort of relating to you guys of the sort of the difficulty of what you've done and the kind of impressive results you've got from it, because it's a very wide-ranging subject that impacts lots of sort of crime themes, as I'm sure you guys know. So yeah, to have a presentation considering the evaluation, it's not something I've seen before, and I think you've had a really good stab at it and raised some really interesting points. So just a well done for you and your team from me, really.
Thanks, Scott. It's good to get positive feedback. But I was more so going to say, as you're doing this profile, we're very happy to have a conversation with you. We produced a policy brief, but we've got a lot more data that we're going to be analysing and writing up over the following months and years. So if there's anything else that we can do to help you with that one, and of course I worked with some analysts in SYP who have carried out problem profiles themselves, so there's probably some shared learning that they've got from both doing that work and been involved in this research project as well. And one of them is Ashley, who's got his hand up, so I wonder what he's going to add to this.
Awesome. Yeah, cheers, gents.
I was just going to say, Scott, I think I've actually read your profile. I think it inspired ours when we did ours within South Yorkshire. So yeah, it kind of goes around in a circle. But I just wanted to say, like, I think I don't say anything massively different from what Matt was talking about in terms of evaluation, but in terms of, I think, just working within the police and having to be it's quite difficult, I think, because say with police jobs, they often happen, they go, we've had the arrests, we've had the seizures, we've had the disruptions, job done, move on. And we've got Clear Hold Build, and Clear Hold Build is Home Office led and sponsored, and we've kind of got that steer from it. I think within police, it's quite difficult unless you've got that framework, that national framework, to actually sit outside of that and go, hang on, we need to evaluation, despite this not being, Home Office or national led or some initiative around that. So we've got frameworks like Morale, SOC system tasking, which specifically looks at OCGs. Then you've got things like, individual dealers who might not quite fit in that framework, and the question then becomes, whose job is it to deal with those when there might not be that kind of framework in that place to look at them. So it's kind of, yeah, and I think it's one of the things that came out from interviews was about disruptions, what disruptions really mean and how they're understood. That's a bit of a difficulty within the policing environment, I think, because it's not clear quite how much guidance is given by officers who are told to submit disruptions, like what they actually should be looking for, and what's a sort of coherent, robust way to sort of say this is a minor, moderate, or not disruption at all. So I think it is difficult, but for me, I think evaluation is just so important, and I think we're barely on the way to sort of actually really getting a head round about how to do that, really thoroughly and robustly.
Yeah, thank you. Really interesting to have your thoughts there. I am aware of the time. I know there was another question from someone in the chat about what they can do from a disability campaigner point of view. I think as we're already on the time, I'd ask if you could maybe follow up with Matt and Xavier afterwards. Of course, this presentation, the slides and the recording will be available on the NAPRP website. I'd also just like to bring your attention to our next event that we're having on the 20th, so fortnight tomorrow, I think, which is another webinar on another small grant, which is about the investigation and training on digitally enabled coercive control. So if that's of interest to yourselves or any of your colleagues, please do sign up for that. It's going to be the sign up's going to be available on the NAPRP website from this afternoon. And yeah, thanks ever so much to Matt, Xavier, Ashley, and the team for this research. As has been pointed out, it's quite an impressive achievement. And it's been really great as well being able to support something that's so co-produced and is a real collaborative effort between the academics and the police partners. If you've got any follow-up questions on any aspects of it, please do get in touch with Matt. And thank you very much. I'll stop the recording now and let everyone get off to the rest of their afternoon. So.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks all.